live in a highly unequal world. Hundreds of millions of people suffer from hunger, malnutrition, and undernutrition due to wars, occupation, discrimination, marginalization, and the concentration of power and wealth. Unpaid care work, mostly done by women, heavily subsidizes the entire global economy, contributing over $10 trillion annually. Despite falling commodity prices, we see food remains unaffordable for the global majority, while super profits are being made along entire value chains by a handful of transnational companies. Profits are put before our inherent human right to food. The burden of debt has tripled amongst low-income countries, restricting their capacity to invest in public services and essential public infrastructure, which has severe impacts, especially for women and other marginalized groups. Trapped in debt, countries remain locked into producing commodities for export instead of supporting agroecological food producers who actually feed us. Unfair trade regimes fuel unsustainable competition between producers and workers, and protectionist subsidies, dumping practices, and unilateral sanctions reinforce historical economic inequalities, while conflicts and war push millions into severe food crises and forced starvation, as seen in Gaza, Yemen, Sudan, Congo, Lebanon, and Haiti. We thank the HLPE for highlighting many of these issues, especially the intersectionality of discriminations that deepen and perpetuate inequalities globally. We thank the rapporteur of the process, Lara Lobo, as well as the CFS Secretariat, and everyone involved in the negotiations for bringing attention to structural causes like power concentration, debt, trade, and sanction. The rapporteur's commitment and guidance gave the needed space that facilitated important, but at the same time difficult conversations on topics that for the first time found a platform within the CFS. This must lay the foundation for further and deeper commitments to actually overcome inequalities caused by the global economic architecture. The resultant policy recommendations recognize how racism, discrimination, and disability intersect with food security, while maintaining vital references to occupation, protracted crises, and the unacceptable use of forced starvation in warfare. These recognitions show the value of the CFS in raising critical global issues. We call on CFS and its members to see this document as a point of departure for coordinated responses rather than a point of arrival. We have made progress in recognizing and addressing some structural issues in this document. However, during these negotiations, the rights of various groups were either invisibilized or jeopardized. LGBTQIA+, indigenous peoples, and women in all our diversity. Without fully recognizing and respecting the self-determination of those who are most marginalized, we cannot hope to achieve truly equitable and sustainable food systems. I'll hand over to my relative.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. During these negotiations, we experienced a setback on the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples regarding self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent. We were under the guidance from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Senor Francisco Cali, Our mandate was to see our rights encompassed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples realized and respected. However, instead we experienced comments made regarding the non-binding nature of the UN Declaration, specifically stating that we should be careful when citing this document because it is merely aspirational. In this regard, I will read a statement made by the 3 United Nations Indigenous Specific mandates, namely the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, issued in February of this year. And I quote, "The adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples represents a milestone global achievement of the Indigenous Peoples movement as the most comprehensive statement regarding the rights of Indigenous peoples. Its adoption is the clearest indication that the international community is committed to protecting the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. These rights and their participation were enforced and reiterated during the 2014 UN Conference on Indigenous Peoples. Despite existing global consensus around the UN DRIP, we have observed developments that have raised concerns about the integrity and backdrop of the rights of Indigenous peoples. In particular, we have observed that many conventions and processes, the term Indigenous peoples has been used in conjunction with other ambiguous terms and groups such as local communities. In fact, the characteristics, nature, and origins of the rights of Indigenous peoples are very different from other groups. Therefore, we, the UN mechanisms of Indigenous peoples, urge all UN entities in their methods of work to refrain from conflating, associating, combining Indigenous peoples with non-Indigenous entities such as minorities, vulnerable groups, or local communities. Additionally, end quote. Additionally, there were negotiations taking place behind closed doors, negotiating the language on the rights of Indigenous peoples in relation to our traditional knowledge. We respectfully reiterate that Indigenous peoples must speak for themselves in all UN fora. The setback in fully recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples in these negotiations is a reminder that without fully respecting the self-determination of those who are most marginalized, we cannot hope to achieve truly equitable and sustainable food systems. The rights of Indigenous peoples as outlined in UN DRIP are not optional. We must remain vigilant as the human rights are daily threatened, violated, and questioned. The CFS must be a space where we continuously advocate for its enforcement, uptake, implementation, not for its deterioration, however. As a result, the CSIPM will add an explanatory note to the annex of the final report that reads the following. The CSIPM supports the endorsement of the PRs and will contribute to the dissemination of the recommendations within this document that address the structural causes of inequalities. However, the CSIPM does not think that the recommendations adequately respect and protect the integrity of the rights of Indigenous peoples enshrined in the UN DRIP. The CSIPM therefore disassociates from all textual references on Indigenous peoples and their individual and collective rights with these PRs and as a basis for future CFS processes. Finally, with the future theme of Indigenous peoples of the CFS, the language used promoting Indigenous peoples' food systems and traditional practices, we see no mention of our rights. We look forward to engaging in good faith to strengthen support for our internationally recognized and distinct rights in all FAO processes and in all of our collective struggles for food sovereignty and food security. Many thanks to the chair and to all member states for allowing us to take this time. We wish.